I was working at a tire and brake shop back then, which was honestly not a terrible job considering I didn't really know what I wanted to do with my life. I had been there for maybe a year and a half. My friend, Jeremy, worked at a grocery store about 10 minutes from my apartment. We'd known each other since high school, so we'd been friends long enough that we didn't really have to make plans very far in advance. One of us would text the other and we'd figure something out. Jeremy was the kind of person who always wanted to be doing something. If we had a Saturday with nothing planned, he'd come up with some stupid idea by noon. Fishing, driving somewhere we'd never been, going to a bar, helping somebody move, whatever. I was usually the one who complained about it and then went anyway. I was also dating a girl named Grace at the time. We'd been together for a little over a year, and she had met Jeremy several times. She liked him, which wasn't always the case with my friends. She thought he was funny, although she used to complain that he could turn literally any conversation into a story about himself. The weekend we went camping, Grace was supposed to come with us originally. She ended up having to work Saturday morning and didn't want to drive out later, so it became just me and Jeremy. We weren't serious campers. We didn't have expensive equipment or know what we were doing. We'd both gone camping with our families when we were younger, and we'd done a couple of overnight trips together. But this wasn't some organized backpacking trip. Jeremy had found the area through somebody he worked with. It was a secluded spot somewhere in the western part of the state, a decent drive from where we lived. I don't remember the exact name of the area, and I wouldn't be surprised if I got it wrong now anyway. It was one of those places where you could pull off a rough road and find trails that weren't really marked very well. He told me there was a clearing where people camped, but it wasn't an official campground. At the time, it just sounded better than staying at one of those campgrounds where you could hear somebody's generator running 20 feet away. We left later than we planned because Jeremy had to stop at a gas station and buy food. By the time we got off the main road, there wasn't much around us. The roads got narrower and turned into gravel. We passed a couple of houses at first, then nothing. I remember having to follow Jeremy because his truck was better suited for the road than my car. At one point, I joked that if he got us lost, I was sleeping in the truck. He said, "You'll be fine. I know where I'm going." He did not, in fact, know exactly where he was going. We eventually found the clearing he'd been talking about, though, so I gave him credit for that. There was a fire ring made from stones and an area that looked like people had parked there before. The trees surrounded the clearing on almost every side, and there wasn't another campsite visible anywhere. We set up the tent while there was still some daylight left. Jeremy started the fire while I unpacked the food. It got colder as the sun went down, and eventually we started hearing the normal noises you'd expect in the woods. At one point, there was a loud crack somewhere behind the campsite, and Jeremy picked up a stick like he was going to fight a bear. Eventually, we finished the beers and decided to turn in. The tent was one of those cheap two-person tents that was technically big enough for 2 people, but not comfortably. We talked for another 20 minutes after getting into the tent. I don't remember what time it was when we fell asleep. What I do remember is waking up because I had to use the bathroom. I was outside the tent for like 20 seconds when Jeremy woke up and asked where I was going. I told him I had to take a leak. He said, "Don't get eaten." I told him to go back to sleep. There wasn't really anywhere to go except into the trees, so I walked a short distance away from the campsite. I wasn't going very far. I just wanted enough privacy that I wasn't standing right next to the tent. The woods were pretty dark. There was some moonlight. I finished and started walking back. I had only been away from the tent for a few minutes when I heard Jeremy's voice. "Hey," I stopped. It sounded like it came from deeper in the woods. "Come here, I found something." It sounded exactly like him, not somebody who sounded like him. It was his voice. I thought he'd gotten out of the tent to mess with me. I yelled, "What?" "Come here, I found something." It sounded farther away. He had probably found some animal or something and wanted to show me. I started walking toward the voice, wasn't scared. I walked between the trees, calling his name. There was no answer. I heard something moving behind me. I turned around. and Jeremy came running out of the trees from the opposite direction. He was breathing hard. He looked confused when he saw me. I said, "Dude, what the hell?" He stopped a few feet away. He was out of breath enough that he had to put his hands on his knees. Then he looked past me toward the woods. He asked, "Who were you talking to?" I remember just staring at him. I said, "You." "No, I was over there." He pointed behind himself. I didn't understand what he meant. I said, "You just called me." He told me he had walked away from the campsite because he needed to go to the bathroom too. I said, "You literally told me to come here." He looked at me like I was messing with him. That was the first thing that bothered me. Jeremy laughed at everything. He was the kind of person who would make a joke even if somebody was trying to be serious. Instead, he just kept looking toward the trees. I asked him if he'd been trying to scare me. He said no. I asked him if he had heard somebody talking. He said no. Then he asked me again, "You heard my voice?" I said yes. He told me he had been nowhere near me. I didn't have an explanation. We walked back to the campsite together. Once we got back, Jeremy checked around the tent and the clearing like somebody might actually be there. He didn't find anything. I was saying, like, maybe somebody else is camping out here. Jeremy said, "Then why would they sound like me?" We got back into the tent. For a while, we just lay there without talking. Eventually, Jeremy said, "If you hear my voice again, don't go anywhere." I laughed a little because the way he said it made it sound more serious than I thought it needed to be. I don't know exactly how long we slept after that. The next thing I remember was Jeremy waking me up because his phone was ringing. It was his girlfriend. He answered and started talking quietly so he wouldn't wake me, although I was already awake. I could hear pieces of their conversation. Eventually, he got out of the tent and stood a little ways away while he finished talking to her. I stayed inside for a few minutes, then got out because I wanted to check my phone. There wasn't much signal, but I had some. I sat near the fire ring and scrolled through messages. Grace had texted me earlier asking if we were alive. I sent her a picture of the campsite and told her we were fine. I remember she replied something about the place looking creepy. I laughed when I read it. At that point, I wasn't really thinking about what happened earlier, or at least I was trying not to. Jeremy eventually went back inside the tent. I stayed outside. The fire had mostly burned down, and I was sitting there looking at my phone when I heard something from the direction of the trees. It sounded like somebody saying my name. I looked up. I couldn't make out the word. At the time, I thought somebody had said my name. I put my phone down. I listened. Nothing. I looked toward the tree line. The woods were almost black. I remember thinking about what had happened earlier and wondering if Jeremy had decided to mess with me after all. I stood up. I didn't walk deep into the woods. I just walked a little closer to the edge of the clearing. I wanted to see if somebody was standing there. I remember looking between the trees for a few seconds. Then I saw something. A kid. It was standing near the tree line. It looked small. It wasn't wearing anything I could clearly identify. I mostly remember the shape of the person standing there. I stared. My first thought was that somebody's child was out there, which immediately made no sense. There were no other cars, no other tents, no houses nearby that I knew of. And even if there had been another family camping somewhere farther into the woods, why would a kid be standing alone in the dark watching me? I said, "Hey." The figure didn't move. I saw its face, or what I thought was its face. The light was terrible, so I don't want to pretend I could see every detail, but I remember the eyes. They looked completely black. Black. I remember staring at them and thinking that there was something wrong with the face, because I couldn't see the normal reflection you'd expect from someone's eyes in the little bit of light coming from the campsite. The person was looking at me. I don't remember seeing them blink. I took a step backward. The figure didn't react. I got scared. I turned around and ran back toward the tent, grabbed the tent zipper, and pulled it open so hard that Jeremy asked what was wrong. I told him there was somebody outside. He looked out. He asked me if I was serious and crawled out of the tent. I told him not to. He ignored me. He stood there looking toward the trees. I stayed behind him. He couldn't see anything. I told him I didn't care and that we were leaving. Once we got back onto a proper road, Jeremy finally said, "I'm never coming back here." I said, "Me neither." Later, we talked about it. He told me he still didn't know how I could have heard his voice when he'd been somewhere completely different. One day, this is like months later, we were hanging out at another friend's house. His name was Chase. Chase had grown up in that part of state and knew the area we had gone camping better than we did. He said, "You guys camp there?" His reaction was strange. He said people around there didn't go into that part of the woods. He'd never seen anything himself. He'd just heard people talk about it. You know, I know what Jeremy sounds like. I've known him for years. And when I heard him say, "Come here, I found something," I didn't hesitate because I recognized his voice. That's why I followed it. If I'd heard some random person calling me from the woods, I probably would have gone straight back to the campsite. I was living with my older brother at the time. We had rented a small 2-bedroom place because neither of us could afford to live alone, and it worked out pretty well. He was a few years older than me and had a completely different schedule. He worked and usually left the house before I even woke up. It wasn't an exciting period of my life. I was in my 20s, single, working a job I didn't like, and trying to save enough money to get my own apartment. Most of my friends had moved farther away after high school, so I didn't really go out much during the week. My brother used to make fun of me because I was always driving somewhere for no reason. If I couldn't sleep, I'd go get something to eat. If I was bored, I'd drive around. If I needed one thing from the store, I'd somehow turn it into an hour-long drive. That night wasn't much different. I'd gotten home from work around 6, ate dinner with my brother, and spent most of the evening playing games in my room. Around midnight, one of my friends texted me asking if I wanted to meet up. He was staying with his girlfriend about 25 minutes away and said they were going to get food. I don't remember why I decided against it. I think I was tired and I had work the next morning. I told him I'd catch him another day. Around 1 in the morning, I was still awake. My brother had already gone to bed. I remember walking into the kitchen to get something to drink and seeing his boots sitting beside the back door. He'd been complaining all week that he needed new ones because the soles were coming apart. I eventually decided to go for a drive. I just wanted to get out of the house for a little while. The town where we lived wasn't huge. Once you got outside the main roads, there were long stretches of farmland, wooded areas, and roads that seemed to go on forever. There were a couple of routes I liked taking when I wanted to clear my head. One of them ran through a rural area and connected back to the highway. I had driven it plenty of times during the day. It was a different story. There were almost no streetlights. I wasn't worried about that. I'd driven those roads before. I left the house around 1:20. My brother was asleep, so I didn't tell him where I was going. I just grabbed my keys and left. I was thinking about work the next day and whether I should start looking for another job. I also remember checking my gas gauge and realizing I was going to have to fill up soon. That was something I kept putting off. Eventually, I turned onto the rural road. There were a few houses at the beginning, and then they became less frequent. After another couple of miles, there wasn't much around except fields and trees. It was probably close to 2 in the morning when I felt the car pull slightly to the right. I corrected it and kept going. A few seconds later, the steering wheel felt strange. I slowed down and heard the unmistakable sound of a tire flapping against the pavement. I pulled over. I had never been good at changing tires. I knew how to do it, obviously, but it was one of those things I'd only done a couple of times and never wanted to do again. I turned the car off and sat there. There wasn't another car in sight. I got out and walked around to the driver's side first, then crouched down to look at the tire. It was completely flat. I opened the trunk and pulled out the spare, jack, and tire iron. I was thinking that I should have just gone to the gas station earlier. The temperature had dropped enough that I could see my breath. I put the jack underneath the car and started loosening the lug nuts. I was annoyed, cold, and mostly thinking about getting home. I looked up. There was a woman standing in the road. I don't mean she was walking toward me. She wasn't walking at all. She was standing there, right in the middle of the road. I stopped what I was doing. I thought I was looking at a sign or something. She was wearing what looked like a long, light-colored dress or coat. although I couldn't tell which. There was no car around her. I looked behind her. Nothing. She was completely alone. I stood up. She didn't move. I wasn't particularly scared at that point. I called out, "Do you need help?" Nothing. It was 2 in the morning. I was standing beside my car, changing a tire, and there was somebody standing in the middle of an empty road who wasn't responding to me. I started wondering if she was drunk. I took a couple steps toward her. Then she lifted her head. I stopped. I can't explain exactly what was wrong with her face. That's the part I've had the hardest time describing whenever I've told this story. She looked like a normal woman from a distance, but there was something about her face that didn't look right. It wasn't that she was disfigured. She wasn't covered in blood or anything like that. There was nothing obviously wrong. It was like I couldn't make my brain settle on what I was looking at. Her features looked almost too still. Her mouth was slightly open, but she wasn't saying anything. Her eyes were fixed directly on me. I called out one more time, "Are you okay?" She didn't answer. Maybe she couldn't hear me. I was about to take another step forward when a thought went through my head. I don't know where it came from, but it was basically, "Don't go any closer." She wasn't moving. The weird thing was that I couldn't see her breathing. Maybe it was because of the distance. Maybe the lighting made it impossible. I decided I was going to get back to my car. I figured if she needed help, I could call 911 once I got somewhere with service. I didn't feel comfortable walking up to a stranger in the middle of nowhere at 2 in the morning. I turned around, crouched beside the tire again, picked up the tire iron and started working on the next lug nut. But I looked up again. She was standing beside my driver's door. I dropped the tire iron. I don't know how she got there. That's not me saying I didn't notice her walking. I mean, I literally don't know when she moved. She had been 50 yards away. I had looked down at the tire. It couldn't have been more than a few seconds. And now she was standing next to the driver's door. I could see her. She was close enough that I could make out her face. And whatever I'd noticed from a distance was much worse up close. Her face was wrong. Her skin wasn't rotten or damaged. Her eyes weren't glowing. There wasn't anything supernatural looking in the obvious sense. She just didn't look like somebody standing there normally. Her expression was completely blank. Her eyes were open wider than they should have been, and she was looking directly at me. I couldn't move. She was like 6 or 7 feet away from me. I remember looking at her face and thinking that I should say something. I couldn't. She didn't say anything either. We just looked at each other. She wasn't wearing shoes. It was cold enough that I was wearing a jacket, jeans, and boots, and she was standing barefoot on the pavement. I looked down at her feet, then back at her face. She still hadn't moved. I slammed the driver's door and immediately locked it, then locked it again. She was still standing beside me. I didn't start the car right away. My hands were shaking, that I couldn't get the key into the ignition properly. She was looking through the window. I couldn't see her reflection properly because of the angle and the darkness, but I could see her face. I remember thinking that I was having some kind of panic attack. Maybe I was exhausted. Or maybe she was a real woman who was drunk or mentally ill or in some kind of crisis. I finally got the car started. The woman didn't move. I shifted into drive. She was still beside the driver's door. I pressed the gas. The car moved forward. She was directly beside the driver's side, so as the car moved, she disappeared from my view. I looked in the side mirror. She wasn't there. I looked in the rearview mirror. Nothing. I drove like 3 or 4 miles before my phone connected. I called my friend. I don't remember what I said. Something like, "I need you to stay on the phone with me." Something just happened. He immediately asked if I'd been drinking. He asked where I was. I gave him the road name. He told me to call 911. I remember arguing with him for some reason. I said I didn't know if there was actually anything to report. He said, "Dude, you're calling me at 2 in the morning telling me there's a woman standing in the middle of the road and then somehow she's next to your car. Just call." So I did. I pulled over near a gas station that was closed and spoke to the dispatcher. I told her I'd gotten a flat tire and encountered a woman on the road. I explained that I was scared and that I'd left the scene. She asked me whether the woman had threatened me. I said no. I just told her the woman had been standing in the road and then appeared beside my car. The dispatcher told me to stay where I was. I was embarrassed. They were calm and didn't act like I was crazy. They walked toward the area where I'd seen the woman. There were no houses nearby, no parked vehicles. My brother was awake when I got home. I had expected him to be asleep, but he was sitting in the living room watching television. A few hours later, I called my mom and told her I'd had a weird experience. I didn't tell her the entire thing because I knew she'd worry. She still worried. She asked me why I was driving around alone at 2 a.m. I told her I couldn't sleep. She said that wasn't an answer. The thing is, there was no sign of the woman. I never saw her again. And the distance. I've gone over it in my head more times than I can count. I know where my car was parked. I know where she was standing. I know how long it took me to look back down at the tire and then look up again. It wasn't enough time for someone to walk 50 yards without me noticing. Especially not on an empty road where I was looking directly in her direction. And I don't think I was hallucinating. That's the thing I've had to live with. The police never found anyone. Nobody called about a missing woman that night, at least not that I ever heard. My brother still brings it up. He'll say, "Remember when you abandoned your car because you couldn't change a tire?" And I'll laugh. I don't think I'll ever forget it. It's the fact that she was suddenly beside my driver's door that changed everything for me. The house was cheap enough that I knew there had to be a reason. I was 28 and working in Columbus, Ohio. I wasn't making terrible money, but I had a car payment, some credit card debt from when I'd been between jobs, and I was trying to get out of my roommate's apartment. He had gotten engaged to his girlfriend, and living with them had become one of those situations where nobody was technically doing anything wrong, but I felt like I was constantly in the way. The house I found was a small, 2-bedroom place in an older neighborhood. The landlord was, let's call him K. I don't know how old he actually was. He drove a silver Ford pickup and wore the same kind of work clothes every time I saw him, usually jeans and a dark jacket. I remember walking through the house with him before signing the lease. There wasn't much to see. Living room, kitchen, 2 bedrooms, bathroom, then a hallway running toward the back of the house. At the very end of the hallway was a plain wooden door. I asked what was behind it because there wasn't any reason for a door to be there that I could see. Kay looked at it for a second and said, "Storage." I asked if it was part of the rental. He said no, just leave that alone. It wasn't said aggressively, more like he was telling me not to worry about something that wasn't my responsibility. I remember saying sure. He said there's nothing you need in there anyway. I signed the lease 2 days later. My sister helped me with the heavier stuff, and my friend Frank came over that Saturday with his pickup because I had managed to underestimate how much furniture I actually owned. Frank was the kind of friend who would help you move and then spend the next 3 months reminding you that he had helped you move. At one point, he looked down the hallway and said, "What's that door?" I told him it was storage and that the landlord didn't want me using it. Frank said, "Then obviously there's something good in there." I told him I didn't care. He laughed and went back outside for another box. I'd leave for work around 6:30 in the morning, work until about 4 or sometimes later if they needed people, then go home and go to bed. My sister lived about 30 minutes away and would occasionally stop by. Frank lived farther out, so I mostly saw him on weekends. The hallway door. I didn't think it was important. I came home from work one afternoon and noticed it was open an inch. I remember standing there with my keys still in my hand, looking at it and thinking that I must have opened it while moving something around and forgotten to close it. I pushed it shut. A few days later, it was open again. This time, I was pretty sure I hadn't touched it. I didn't think much about that. The latch might not have caught properly. I started seeing it at night. I'd see a thin black line between the door and the frame when I walked past. One night I heard something from the hallway, a footstep or something. Floor making that hollow wooden sound that happens when someone puts their weight down. I was in bed watching something on my phone. A few seconds later there was another sound. I sat up, The house had an old central heating system that made all kinds of noises, and there was a refrigerator in the kitchen that clicked and hummed, so there were always sounds happening. The next morning, I checked the front door before leaving for work because I had this stupid thought that I'd somehow left it unlocked. It was locked. Everything was fine. The door at the end of the hallway was closed. About a week later, I woke up around 2 in the morning because I heard footsteps again, like they were coming from the hallway. I had work in a few hours and I hated being awake in the middle of the night. I got out of bed and walked toward the hallway. The door at the end was open slightly. I'd never opened it. There wasn't really a reason I couldn't. The landlord hadn't told me I wasn't allowed to open it. He just said to leave it alone. So I reached for the handle. It wouldn't turn. I tried again, locked. I'd never seen a lock on the inside of the house. I don't remember Kay mentioning one. I put my ear near the door. Couldn't hear anything. I saw a faint blue light underneath it. That was probably where the weird light was coming from, although I couldn't understand why there would be electricity running in a storage room that supposedly wasn't being used. The next morning, I opened the door. It wasn't locked anymore. The room behind it was small, maybe the size of a bedroom closet, although the ceiling was higher than I expected. There were some old shelves along one wall, a few cardboard boxes, and what looked like a broken metal cabinet. It smelled like a hospital. It had that combination of antiseptic cleaner, chemical, where the smell was coming from. There was another door inside the room. That was the part that bothered me. It was set into the back wall and looked newer than everything around it. It had a metal handle and a lock. I tried the handle. Locked. I looked around the room for a key but didn't find one. There wasn't much else. I closed the door and went to work. That night, when I came home, the hallway door was locked again. I stood there looking at it. I tried the handle, and it didn't move. I didn't understand why it would be locked when I hadn't locked it. I didn't touch it again. I went to bed. The following morning, it opened normally. I started getting irritated at the whole thing, called Kay around 10. He answered, and I asked him about the storage room. He said, "What about it?" I told him the door was locking and unlocking and that I'd gone inside. He asked me why I'd gone inside. I said, "Because you told me it was storage and I heard something in there." He said, "There's nothing in there." I told him about the second door. He said, "Just leave it alone." I asked him what was behind it. He said, "Nothing that concerns you." I thought that was a weird answer, but I didn't want an argument. I said, "Okay." He hung up. That should have been enough for me to let it go. It wasn't. That night, I was sitting on my bed around 11, talking to my sister on the phone. She was complaining about her boyfriend because he'd apparently forgotten to pick up their dog from her mom's house. I remember laughing at her and telling her she was going to marry that idiot anyway. After we hung up, I put my phone on the nightstand and started brushing my teeth. And I saw somebody walk past my bedroom doorway. It wasn't a shadow. It was a person. I saw the movement from the corner of my eye. Someone moving from the hallway toward the front of the house. I stopped brushing my teeth, walked into the hallway. Nobody was there. I checked the living room. Empty. The kitchen. Nothing. The front door was still locked. I stood there for a while because I didn't know what I had seen. I didn't want to convince myself that someone had been inside the house when I couldn't find any evidence of it. I checked the windows. They were locked. I heard footsteps. They came from somewhere behind me. It sounded like someone walking across a floor. I grabbed my phone and went into the living room. I called Frank. He said, "Dude, what's wrong?" I told him I thought someone was in my house. He asked if I had called the police. I said no. I put my shoes on. Before leaving, I looked down the hallway. The door at the end was closed. I went outside and sat in my car. Around 2 in the morning, I called Kay. He answered. I told him I had left the house because I thought somebody was inside. He said, "You need to stop messing with that door." I said, "I'm not messing with anything. Someone walked through my hallway." That made me angry. I told him I wasn't paying rent to live somewhere where I had to worry about somebody being inside the house. He said, "Then mind your own business and stay out of that room." I remember there being something about his tone that bothered me more than what he actually said. I asked him, "Why are you talking to me like that?" He didn't answer. He said, "Don't open that door again." Then he hung up. I stayed at Frank's place that night. The next day I went back with him. I showed him the storage room. The smell was there. He stood in the doorway and said, "What the hell is that smell?" I told him it had smelled that way the first time I opened it. He went inside and looked around. He didn't touch the second door. I didn't either. We left the room. Frank told me I should move out. I said I couldn't just move out. I'd signed a lease and I didn't have another place lined up. He said, "Then at least don't go in there." I told him I wouldn't. I ended up staying another 4 nights. Nothing happened during those nights. I went to work, came home, cooked dinner, called my sister, watched television. The hallway door stayed closed. On Friday, Kay came by to collect a repair payment I'd asked him about earlier in the week. He stood in the doorway and barely looked at me. I asked him about breaking the lease. He said we'd talk about it. Then he looked past me toward the hallway. He asked, "You haven't opened it again, have you?" I said no. He stared at me. Then he said, "Good." I asked him what was actually in there. He didn't answer. He said, "Some things aren't your concern." I told him that was a ridiculous way to talk to a tenant. He became angry. He said I'd been warned, and if I kept opening the door, I'd have problems. I asked him what that meant. He said, "You don't want to find out." Then he left. I called my sister afterward. I didn't tell her everything because I knew she'd tell me to leave immediately, and I was already trying to figure out how I could afford another deposit. She could tell something was wrong anyway. She asked if Kay had threatened me. I said, "Not exactly." That night I packed a bag. I left most of my furniture because I didn't have anywhere to put it. I drove to my sister's house around midnight. The next morning I went back with her husband and collected the rest of my important stuff. When we arrived, the hallway door was open. My sister's husband looked at it and said, "Was that always open?" I told him no. He walked toward it. I told him not to. He stopped. For some reason, none of us wanted to find out what was inside. We grabbed my clothes, computer, documents, and a few other things. I never slept there again. Kay eventually returned part of my deposit, although he kept enough to cover some excuse about damages that weren't there. I didn't fight him over it. A few months later, I found another apartment. I never found out what was behind the second door. I also never found out why that storage room smelled like a hospital, or why I sometimes heard movement inside the house when I was sure I was alone. The strangest part is that I don't think Kay was surprised by any of it. He already knew which door I was talking about. And he seemed much more worried that I had opened it than he was about anything else.